I told my boyfriend he reminds me of my ex, and he packed his bags. The sentence sounds like a sitcom plot, until you're standing in your living room, watching a man zip shut every piece of evidence that he once planned to stay. My name's Elena Moreno, 26, chronic overexplainer, and cautionary tale in the art of saying the wrong thing at the right time. What I meant as a clumsy compliment detonated like a relationship landmine. It happened on a Thursday evening that smelled faintly of curry and impending disaster. We'd just finished dinner. Jacob had cooked, proudly announcing that he'd finally nailed restaurant-level tikka masala. We were doing dishes, elbows touching, one of those quiet domestic snapshots that make you believe adulthood isn't so scary. He was humming under his breath, sleeves rolled to his forearms, and out of nowhere I said it. "You even do the dishes like Daniel." Daniel, for context, is the ex who still haunts the collective imagination of my friends. The measuring stick for everything from music taste to emotional unavailability. The name slipped out without warning, like muscle memory bumping into guilt. I intended it to mean, "You're thoughtful in the same way," but the instant the words hit air, I saw them mutate into something crueler. Jacob froze midway through rinsing a plate. "Like who?" he asked, though obviously he knew. I tried to pivot, half laughing. It's a good thing, when someone reminds you of a familiar kindness." My voice wobbled like a toddler on roller skates. He stared at the sink, water still running. Finally, he turned it off, dried his hands meticulously, the kind of careful gesture that makes your stomach drop, and said, "If I wanted to compete with a ghost, I'd have joined a seance." At first, my brain misfired straight into sarcasm defense mode. "You're overreacting," I said, and even as it left my mouth, I wanted to claw the words back. Overreacting is what people say when they have no argument left. He walked out of the kitchen, straight to the bedroom. And I followed, explaining in loops, each sentence tangled with the next. I meant comfort, familiarity, not comparison. He didn't yell. He just methodically gathered his clothes from drawers, folding with the calm of a man performing CPR on his own patients. When I finally blurted, "Are you seriously packing?" he answered without looking up. "You think this is small talk, but it tells me there's always a scale in your head, with me ranked against someone who already lost. I don't want to live there." Hearing that hurt more than shouting would have. It hurt because it was honest. He packed quickly, a kind of efficiency he never displayed while tidying. I hovered uselessly, offering explanations, then apologies, then silence because explanations were gasoline. The whole time I could smell faint traces of curry and soap, ordinary scents of a night that apparently marked our ending. By the time he reached the door with his suitcase, I'd cycled through disbelief, anger at my own stupidity, and grief condensed into that heavy air before someone leaves. "I'll stay at Miles and Tess's for a bit," he said, polite but final. "Maybe you can figure out why it slipped out so easily." And then, after a pause that lasted forever, "I still love you. That's what makes this awful." When the door clicked shut, the apartment exhaled emptiness so loud it startled me. Every object screamed his absence. His mug beside mine, the hoodie on the chair, the playlist that kept auto-starting because he'd programmed it to our speaker. I thought about deleting it, then left it playing, like background noise for my regret. The next morning was cruelly normal. Sunlight filtered through blinds, coffee gurgled in the maker, but the second mug remained untouched. I spent hours replaying the conversation in my head, dissecting each syllable for a version of reality where he'd laughed it off. But some words, once spoken, rearranged the molecules of trust. That weekend, my best friend Ria came over armed with croissants and zero tolerance for self-pity. "So what's the plan?" she demanded between bites. I mumbled something about waiting for him to cool down. She pursed her lips. "Elena, he's not punishing you. He's protecting himself. There's a difference." She had a point, annoyingly as always. I tried writing him an apology message, but deleted it 10 times. Every version sounded like PR copy. Instead, I cleaned, scrubbed counters, rearranged books, folded every corner of my impulsiveness into neat apology-sized shapes. That's when I found the photo strip from our first date, hidden under a receipt. Jacob looking goofy, me grinning like I'd already decided on him. I sat on the floor and cried until the tile imprint marked my cheek. 4 days passed. Then came the text. Need to pick up a few things Tuesday. You'll be around? My fingers typed sure before my heart even consulted. The night before he came, I rehearsed lines like an actor. Concise apology, no self-defense. But when he walked in, all rhythm collapsed. He looked exhausted, eyes shadowed, the fixed politeness of someone braced for argument. I handed him the stack of clothes he'd left. I'm sorry, I said, voice small. I compared you to someone who doesn't matter anymore. I wasn't thinking about him. I was thinking about how safe you make me feel. He didn't respond right away, just studied my face, maybe gauging how much of that was genuine repentance versus reflex. Then he said quietly, "It's not him I can't stand. It's how easily you lost the language of us." That sentence would replay in my head like an echo for days. He left again, but slower this time, without his suitcase. A mercy that left a crack for hope. The apartment felt slightly less hollow, as if forgiveness had peeked tentatively through the doorway, but refused to enter until invited properly. That night I called my mom, something I only do when existential panic demands parental grounding. She listened, hummed sympathetically, and finally said, "When you love someone new, the ghosts of old love lessons always come knocking. The trick isn't pretending they're gone, it's learning not to hand them the microphone." I laughed through the lump in my throat. Trust a mother to distill heartbreak into a proverb worth cross-stitching. Over the following week, I avoided both overthinking and underfeeling, a delicate balance I was terrible at. I went to work, designed cheerful product packaging by day, came home to my own unfinished mess of emotions by night. I stopped stalking his social media after realizing he'd muted mine too, a quiet draw of boundaries that stung but made sense. Then one evening, as dusk softened the skyline outside my window, I caught sight of the half-burnt candle Jacob had once called our scent. Amber wood and something citrusy. I lit it. The room filled instantly with that memory of us laughing in better times, cooking in sync, inventing world record puns. Somewhere between the flicker of flame and the crescendo of silence, I decided this couldn't be the end yet. I needed to tell him, not through apology rehearsals, not through retroactive explanations, but through the unpolished truth of how fear and habit sometimes collide. That decision set the stage for what happened next. The clumsy peace talks, the revelation about my own patterns of comparison, and the night he finally knocked on my door again. But that's where the next part begins. When he knocked again, it was a week later, on one of those drizzly evenings that make everything smell like concrete and regret. I'd been curled up on the couch with a blanket and a half-empty mug of chamomile when the sound jolted the air. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it. Jacob always texted first, cautious to avoid awkward surprises. When I opened the door, he stood there, hood dripping, expression unreadable, a paper bag clutched like a peace offering. "Dinner," he said simply. The smell of takeout, our favorite Thai place, slipped past him into the hallway before he did. We didn't hug. Instead, he toed off his shoes, looked around the apartment that still had his ghost lingering in corners, and asked, "Still lighting that ridiculous candle?" I smiled nervously. "It's good for morale." He grunted something halfway between amusement and exhaustion. We spread cartons on the coffee table. Steam and awkwardness fogged the same space for about 5 minutes before he broke the silence. "You said I reminded you of him," he began, voice level but careful. "I've been trying to decide if that's actually an insult or just informational." That rawness startled me. I'd expected sarcasm, not curiosity. I put down my fork. "It wasn't either," I said. "It was bad phrasing for something honest. You reminded me that I could feel safe again. It came out wrong, and I hate that it did." Jacob rubbed at his jaw, listening. Not forgiving yet, but at least not retreating. You know how brutal that sounded for me? I spent a year trying to not be someone else's echo. The honesty hit like cold water. I said quietly, "You were never an echo. You were the first person who made the quiet parts of my life sound like music again." He looked down at the pad thai, shaking his head lightly, as if fighting a smile he didn't trust. And yet, one sentence, and my brain built an entire architecture of failure. He finally met my eyes. "I didn't leave because of anger, Elena. I left because of fear. Fear that you still lived in conversations you had with someone else." That admission cracked something open between us. I nodded, tears choking my words. "I understand. I think I keep old stories like spare keys, just in case love locks me out again. But I promise, that door's closed." He exhaled slowly, "And you have the worst metaphors." We both laughed, the sound trembling, half relief, half disbelief. Dinner stretched into a 2-hour therapy session. We avoided blame and instead dissected patterns, my tendency to compare as protection, his instinct to run before getting hurt. We discovered how similarly we operated, just at opposite speeds. When the rain outside shifted to steady drizzle, our conversations softened too. He told me he'd talked to Miles and Tess about it. Apparently, Tess had said, "If you bail every time someone slips on a past memory, you'll never know anyone long enough to build a new one." "She's annoyingly right," he admitted. By the time dishes were stacked in the sink, the tension had thinned enough that he looked almost comfortable again. Then he did something unexpected, walked to the coat rack, picked up the hoodie he'd left weeks before, and asked, "May I stay? Just to talk a bit longer?" I nodded quickly, too relieved to tease him about asking permission in his own home. We spent that night talking on the couch, no scripts, no promises, just small truths. What scared us, what we missed, what we wanted differently. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he fell asleep mid-sentence, head resting on my shoulder. His breathing was slow, heavy, a song I'd missed without realizing. I stayed perfectly still, afraid to break the spell. When I woke, sunlight was sliding through blinds, painting stripes across the coffee table. He was awake but quiet, scrolling his phone. "I have a meeting," he murmured, standing. Panic flared until he added, "I'll be back tonight. Let's cook." It wasn't an official comeback declaration, but it was the first page of one. After he left, the apartment carried an entirely new silence. Not empty, but pending, like a room waiting for someone to return. I hummed while cleaning, a habit I'd lost in his absence, realizing how much lighter movement feels when hope sneaks in. Throughout that day, we texted in small doses, memes, links, a photo of his disastrous office coffee. Normal things, but what mattered wasn't the content, it was rhythm returning. 48 hours earlier, I wouldn't have believed there'd be a rhythm to return to. When evening came, he arrived with groceries. "We're making something new," he announced, spreading ingredients like puzzle pieces. Cooking together had always been our language. This felt like rewriting the dictionary. Between chopping and stirring, he said, "If we keep building something, we need to stop editing the past every time it shows up." He glanced at me. "Deal?" I answered, "Deal," and meant it. Later, while we ate at the counter, he gestured to the candle again, the one he used to mock. "Smells less like heartbreak now," he said. "More like renewal." I laughed. "You sound like a self-help podcast." He smiled. Maybe I listened to one. That night he stayed, officially, not as visitor or tentative roommate, but as the person who belonged here again. The following week, we kept talking about boundaries, about ghosts, about the possibility of therapy, about deliberate kindness replacing accidental hurt. It wasn't dramatic reconciliation, just two flawed people choosing to keep the conversation alive. Still, every time I passed the window and saw my reflection, I wondered what version of us would come next. Sometimes rebuilding feels like learning a new language, familiar enough to scare you. Part 2 of our story ended there. Two people relearning how to speak without resurrecting shadows. waiting to see if love could bear the weight of awareness better than it bore the weight of illusion. A month later, the calm we'd stitched together started to feel real, not like a truce waiting to unravel, but like ordinary partnership returning from exile. Our lives resembled themselves again, if you squinted. Workdays, laundry, movie nights, tenderness without ceremony. Yet underneath the rhythm lived a cautious astonishment that we'd survived the explosion at all. You don't unfeel that kind of fragility easily. You just learn how to handle it without dropping the good things alongside it. It surprised me how much healing hid inside small domestic tasks. When Jacob forgot to cap the toothpaste, I didn't interpret it as proof of negligence. When I burned rice and swore dramatically, he laughed without teasing. We were learning gentleness in reverse, starting from hurt and building backward to humor. One Sunday morning, sprawled amid half-folded laundry, he turned to me and said, "We should talk about rules for fighting." I blinked. "Like a code of conduct?" He nodded. "Exactly. No ghosts, no character assassination, and whoever's wrong makes pancakes." It sounded ridiculous enough to work. Our arguments became micro-workouts in vulnerability. When I slipped into comparison again, complaining that he wasn't as spontaneous as my ex used to be, he took a breath, then asked calmly, "Is that you asking for more surprise, or just old math showing up again?" That question disarmed the reflex better than anger ever could. "Asking," I admitted. And next weekend, he woke me up at 5 a.m. for a surprise road trip to see the sunrise over the cliffs. It was freezing, messy, imperfectly beautiful, which made it perfect. I began to understand that my tendency to reference Daniel had less to do with longing and more with safety. My brain used comparison as quality control. Once I saw that, I could choose differently. We even joked about enrolling my impulsive tongue in sensitivity training. One night over dinner, I said, "You know, I might slip again someday." He smiled. "Maybe, but next time, I'll remind you instead of packing." That simple statement felt like graduating from emotional kindergarten. Around late March, life tested our fragile maturity. Jacob's company downsized, his name on the unlucky list. Old Jacob would have retreated into silence. This version walked in, held out the layoff letter, and said, "We're going to need insane amounts of pasta." So we boiled water, poured wine, and plotted sensibly chaotic plans, freelance gigs, new portfolios, short-term sacrifices. Stress made us sleepless, but we navigated it as a we, not me versus you. That was the quiet miracle difference between version 1 and version 2 of us. 2 weeks into unemployment, he surprised me again, renovated the tiny second bedroom into a makeshift studio for both of us. "If the world's unstable," he said, "covered in sawdust, let's at least control the paint color." I watched him hang shelves with meticulous patience, remembering that night he'd packed his bags. Same hands, different intention. I began photographing the little moments, not for social posts, but for proof that reconciliation can look mundane and still be holy. One evening, while editing photos at my desk, I found the old picture strip from our first date again. I'd kept it tucked behind a mirror since the breakup. When Jacob came in with tea, I handed it to him. "I kept this as punishment," I confessed, "but I think it's time it graduates to nostalgia." He looked at the blurry frames, our goofy smiles, the ache of innocence, and laughed softly. "We look like people who'd learn everything the hard way." He pinned the strip to the fridge, beside a note that read, "Version 2.0, do not compare." It made me snort every morning after that. By summer, neither of us used the phrase "reminds me of" anymore. We didn't need ghosts as conversational furniture. Instead, we found new shorthand, inside jokes, silly nicknames, emotional Morse code only we could decipher. One night, lying on the balcony under weak city stars, Jacob mused, "I think love's less about never slipping and more about inventing a good way to apologize each time you do." I murmured, "And we're fluent." Around our anniversary, He handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a keychain engraved with a simple date, the day after he came back with Thai food. "Our restart date," he said. "Every time you lose keys again, you'll remember we don't lose everything." I melted and possibly cried on his shirt. He pretended to be stoic, but kissed the top of my head. The next morning, we hosted brunch for friends who'd witnessed our meltdown months earlier. Ria gave a mock speech titled, "How Not to Torpedo a Relationship, a Case Study." Everyone laughed. Jacob squeezed my hand under the table. When I gestured at the group and whispered, "They all still look shocked we made it," he grinned. "That's because people mistake breaking for ending." We just paused. After brunch, when silence finally reclaimed the apartment, I thought about how close we'd come to letting fear dictate the narrative. Now, fear still lived here, but it paid rent. It didn't own the house. We'd learned that love with scar tissue isn't weaker, it's weatherproof. Sometimes, when visitors notice the candle still flickering by the window, they ask if it signifies anything. It does. A reminder that words can burn or warm, depending on how you light them. I keep it alive. Scent of amber. One evening, while editing photos at my desk, I found the old picture strip from our first date again. I'd kept it tucked behind a mirror since the breakup. When Jacob came in with tea, I handed it to him. "I kept this as punishment," I confessed, "but I think it's time it graduates to nostalgia." He looked at the blurry frames, our goofy smiles, the ache of innocence, and laughed softly. We look like people who'd learn everything the hard way. He pinned the strip to the fridge beside a note that read version 2.0. Do not compare. It made me snort every morning after that. By summer, neither of us used the phrase "reminds me of" anymore. We didn't need ghosts as conversational furniture. Instead, we found new shorthand, inside jokes, silly nicknames, emotional Morse code only we could decipher. One night, lying on the balcony under weak city stars, Jacob mused, "I think love's less about never slipping and more about inventing a good way to apologize each time you do." I murmured, "Then we're fluent." Around our anniversary, he handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a keychain, engraved with a simple date. The day after he came back with Thai food. "Our restart date," he said. "Every time you lose keys again, you'll remember we don't lose everything." I melted and possibly cried on his shirt. He pretended to be stoic, but kissed the top of my head. The next morning, we hosted brunch for friends who'd witnessed our meltdown months earlier. Ria gave a mock speech titled, "How Not to Torpedo a Relationship, a Case Study." Everyone laughed. Jacob squeezed my hand under the table. When I gestured at the group and whispered, "They all still look shocked we made it," he grinned. "That's because people mistake breaking for ending." We just paused. After brunch, when silence finally reclaimed the apartment, I thought about how close we'd come to letting fear dictate the narrative. Now fear still lived here, but it paid rent. It didn't own the house. We'd learned that love with scar tissue isn't weaker, it's weatherproof. Sometimes, when visitors notice the candle still flickering by the window, they ask if it signifies anything. It does. A reminder that words can burn or warm, depending on how you light them. I keep it alive, scent of amber and citrus wrapping around our evenings, steady as breath. This, then, is where the story lands. Not in dramatic reunion or cinematic closure, but inside an everyday apartment that smells faintly of curry and trust regained. If you listen closely, you can hear pans clinking, laughter catching on soft edges, and two people learning, after one catastrophic sentence, how to speak to each other in a language no ex ever taught. One made entirely of second chances and unhurried grace.